The player who just fell to number 45 has a realistic path back toward the top 30 before the grass season begins, and she has a realistic path toward something approaching her 2025 Roland Garros result. If the clay game she developed at the Rafa Nadal Academy starts to show up when it counts, the Czech curse will not be broken in Linz or Madrid. Czech players are not especially known as clay specialists in this generation, so the specific phobia may simply manifest less often during the spring swing. But the underlying technical work that needs to happen, the serve improvement that Gilbert identified, the return numbers that Muchova exposed, the mental adjustment to competing against players who have neutralized the pattern she relies on, that work has to happen on clay regardless of whether the opponent holds a Czech passport. Eala knows it. Her team knows it. The question is whether the clay season gives her enough time and the right draw conditions to work through it before Roland Garros arrives and the stakes go back up. The prize money question follows her to every tournament. At Linz, the WTA 500 prize pool is significantly smaller than a 1,000 event. At Roland Garros, where the conversations about player revenue share are loudest, she will walk into a tournament where the champion earns roughly 2.79 million AUD equivalent, and the first-round losers earn a fraction of that. She will be one of the most watched players in the draw based on everything that happened in Miami and Indian Wells. Her presence will drive ticket sales and TV ratings in Asia, and specifically in the Philippines, where her results are national news. The tournament will benefit from her being there, from her winning matches, from her creating drama and storylines. And whatever check she collects on her way out will not fully account for that contribution. That is the system she is working within. That is what the players, led by Sabalenka and Goff and others, are trying to change. There is a version of the next 5 years in which Eala becomes the player who finally changes the conversation in a permanent way. Not because she gives a speech or signs a letter, but because her presence makes the disparity impossible to ignore. A 20-year-old from the Philippines who crashes ticket systems and sells more merchandise than players ranked 30 spots above her, who brings tens of thousands of first-time fans into tennis, who represents a market of over 100 million people, who previously had no reason to watch a WTA 500 in Austria, and who does all of this while earning a tenth of what the champion earns. That story, told over years and tournaments and rounds, is more powerful than any formal letter to a Grand Slam committee. It is the kind of story that eventually makes a number look embarrassing to the people in rooms who set those numbers. There is a number that tells you everything you need to know about where Alex Eala stands right now, and it is not the one printed on her prize money check. It is not the 6-0 scoreline from the first set of her round of 16 match against Karolina Muchova at Hard Rock Stadium. It is not the 0-13, her staggering, almost cosmically cruel record against Czech players on the WTA Tour. It is not even the 16 ranking places she dropped overnight, tumbling from world number 29 down to number 45 in a single result. The number that tells you everything is this: 11 months. That is the distance between the version of Alex Eala, who reached the Miami Open semifinals in 2025, who beat Madison Keys and Iga Swiatek and stood on the precipice of a final, and the version of Alex Eala, who walked off a grandstand court in March 2026, having lost the first set without winning a single game. 11 months between the best tennis of her young life and the most humbling hour of it. 11 months, and the WTA Tour had changed everything around her and changed nothing about the one problem that keeps following her like a shadow: the Czech wall, the curse that will not break. And yet, somehow, the most remarkable thing about Alex Eala right now is not what happened on that court. It is what is happening off it. Because in the aftermath of a loss that could have defined her in the worst possible way, Eala did something that no ranking, no scoreline, and no prize money check can fully capture. She showed everyone exactly who she is. Let's start with what actually happened, because the facts alone are dramatic enough to carry a story that does not need any embellishment. Alex Eala arrived in Miami, ranked world number 29, seeded 31st in a 96-player draw, carrying the weight of being the most commercially significant player in the field who was not named Aryna Sabalenka. Her presence at the Miami Open had been building since last year's semifinal run, the run that made her the first Filipino player ever to reach a WTA 1000 semifinal, the run that rewrote what was possible for an entire nation. This year, she came back as a genuine contender, not just a feel-good story. She was seeded. She had a first-round bye. She had wins over Laura Siegemund in 3 sets and Magda Linette in straight sets under her belt before she stepped onto the grandstand for the 4th round. She had earned her place in the round of 16 the hard way, and the crowd at Hard Rock Stadium knew it. Then Karolina Muchova walked onto the court and reminded everyone that knowing your place and keeping your place are 2 entirely different things. What followed was one of the most efficiently clinical performances seen at this tournament in years. Muchova, ranked 14th in the world and fresh off her Doha Open title, did not just beat Eala, she dismantled her. She took the first set 6-0 in 22 minutes, winning 52 points to Eala's 26 across the entire match and converting all 5 break points she earned. She dominated from first serve to final winner, winning 80% of her first serve points compared to Eala's 39. The numbers read less like a competitive tennis match and more like a technical assessment, a ruthless diagnostic of exactly where Eala's game currently has gaps that elite opponents know how to find and exploit. The match lasted exactly 1 hour. When it was over, Eala had committed 32 errors, managed just 7 winners, and extended her record against Czech opposition on the WTA Tour to 0-13. 0 wins, 13 losses against players from one country, at every level, in every surface condition, across her entire professional career since 2020. Marketa Vondrousova, Barbara Krejcikova, Linda Fruvirtova, Marie Buskova, Katerina Siniakova, Linda Noskova, Teresa Martinkova. And now for the 2nd consecutive WTA 1000 tournament, the same final destination. A Czech player, a grandstand exit, and a scoreline that read 6-0, 6-2 both times. Brad Gilbert, watching from somewhere with a legal pad and an opinion, was not kind. He concluded publicly that Eala needed to dramatically improve her serve, pointing to the 36% first serve points one figure as a structural problem that elite opponents will continue to punish until it is fixed. He was right, and the fact that he was right is part of what makes this story so interesting. Because Alex Eala is not just a talent who got lucky at the right moment last year, she is a talent who has real identifiable technical limitations that serious opponents at this level have figured out how to attack. That is not a crisis. That is a development problem. Development problems have solutions. The question is what she does between now and the clay swing to start finding them. But before we get to what comes next, we need to sit with what those results cost her, because the prize money structure at the Miami Open is something that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Eala earned $105,120 for her 4th round finish, a number that is simultaneously impressive and instructive. It is impressive because a year ago, before her 2025 Miami breakthrough, a check of that size would have represented more than her entire career earnings to that point. It is instructive because it represents the floor of what this tournament considers adequate compensation for a player who sold out stadiums, crashed ticket systems, drove viewership numbers that outpaced players ranked well above her, and represented the most culturally significant story of the American hardcourt swing. $105,000 for all of that, for 3 wins, and a grandstand crowd that showed up for every point, for a presence that the Miami Open will absolutely use in promotional materials for next year's event. Compare that to what Aryna Sabalenka took home. The world number 1, who defeated Coco Gauff 6-2, 4-6, 6-3 in the final to complete the Sunshine Double and become just the 5th woman in history to win both Indian Wells and Miami in the same year, earned $151,380. That is more than 10 times what Eala earned. The runner-up, Gauff, took home $612,340. The semifinalists, Elena Rybakina and Muchova, earned $340,190 each. The quarterfinalists earned $193,645. And then the 4th round exits, a group that included Eala alongside Mira Andreeva, Sorana Cirstea, Amanda Anisimova, Jelena Ostapenko, and Zheng Qinwen, collected $105,120. From the champion to the 4th round, the gap is not a step, it is a canyon. A player who reaches the final earns 5.8 times more than a player who falls in the round of 16. A player who wins it all earns nearly 11 times more. And the total prize pool of 9,415,725, while the largest in WTA 1000 history, still represents a percentage of total tournament revenue that the players have been publicly and loudly demanding needs to change. This is the context in which Eala's loss lands, and it is the context in which the broader conversation about women's tennis right now becomes impossible to separate from the individual storyline. Because while Eala was packing her bags and preparing for the clay season, the fight for what these players are actually worth was accelerating around her. Sabalenka, who had just won the tournament and pocketed the champion's check, had spent much of the past year as one of the most prominent voices in that fight. She had spoken at the Australian Open about the conversations with Grand Slam organizers, careful in her language but clear in her meaning. The players were not satisfied. The prize money had increased, yes. The percentages relative to total revenue were still not where the players believed they should be. The formal letters sent in March and July of 2025, demanding fairer revenue sharing and a genuine seat at the decision-making table, had not yet produced the outcomes the players wanted. The conversations were ongoing. The frustration was real. Coco Gauff had been even more direct. At the Australian Open, where the prize pool had increased to 111.5 million Australian dollars, Gauff acknowledged the improvement and then immediately framed what still needed to change. She noted that while the prize money had gone up in absolute terms, the percentage of revenue going to players remained below where the players believed it should be. She called for continued conversations, not just with the Australian Open, but with all 4 Grand Slams. She was not ungrateful. She was not unreasonable. She was asking for the sport to treat its players as partners in value creation, rather than as costs to be managed. That is not a radical position. It is the position that any labor force with leverage eventually reaches, and these players have leverage. Into this fight, Eala walked with something more powerful than a press conference statement or a formal letter. She walked in with a story, a 20-year-old from the Philippines, playing her first full season at this level, ranked 29th in the world, earning less than a tenth of what the champion earned, despite driving a significant portion of the tournament's cultural conversation and media attention. She did not choose that story. She did not manufacture it. It is simply the truth of her position. And the truth of her position makes the argument for fairer revenue distribution more viscerally than any statistical breakdown ever could. Because when you look at what Eala brought to Miami, the sold-out sessions, the Filipino diaspora filling the stands, the jersey sales, the viewership numbers, the ticket system crashes, the social media traffic, and then you look at the $105,720 check she took home for it, something does not add up, and the players know it does not add up. And increasingly, the tennis world is paying attention. Sabalenka, for her part, completed the Sunshine Double and added $151,380 to a career earnings total that had already passed the $47 million mark, making her only the second woman in history after Serena Williams to reach that level. She had joined Steffi Graf, Kim Clijsters, Victoria Azarenka, and Iga Swiatek in the exclusive history of players to sweep Indian Wells and Miami in the same season. She had beaten Rybakina in the semifinals 6-4, 6-3, and then outlasted Gauff in 3 sets in a final that tested everything she had mentally and physically. It was by any measure one of the dominant runs in recent WTA history. And yet, even Sabalenka, standing in the winner's circle, celebrating a historic achievement, knew that the work was not done. She had been in those rooms with the Grand Slam organizers. She had signed those letters. She had spoken at press conferences and moved carefully through the language of collective bargaining while still being direct enough that no one missed the message. The players want more. The players deserve more. And she was going to keep pushing for it. What Eala brings to that fight is something Sabalenka does not have in the same way. She brings the most compelling version of the argument. Because Sabalenka earns $1.1 million for winning a tournament, and it is genuinely difficult to argue she should earn less, she is the world #1 at the peak of her powers, doing things that only 4 other women in history have done. But when a 20-year-old from a country where $105, $720 represents generational wealth, who sells more jerseys than anyone else in the field, who brings new fans to a sport that desperately needs them, who packs stadiums in a way that marketing departments spend millions trying to manufacture, when that player earns a tenth of what the champion earns, the disparity becomes human-sized. It becomes something you can feel. That is the conversation Eala is part of now, whether she asked for it or not. Earlier this year, speaking on the Served podcast with Andy Roddick, she had reflected on what her sudden rise to fame had meant to her personally. She had spoken about the crowds with a kind of wonder that was entirely genuine. She had watched the videos of the lines outside the stadiums, the fans with her jerseys, the people who had taken time out of their days to come and watch her play, and she had admitted to a period of disbelief before the reality sank in. She had talked about the balance she was trying to find between confidence and humility, between the version of herself who competed and the version who understood what she represented beyond the scoreline. If I can master the times I need to be confident and the times I need to be humble and grateful, she said, I think that's an amazing recipe. It was the kind of answer that explained why people kept showing up for her regardless of the result. After the loss to Muchova, Eala kept that same composure. She had told the press before the match that she felt ready, that she was prepared physically and mentally for the challenge. When the challenge turned out to be a 6-0, 6-2 dismantling, she acknowledged it honestly. She talked about the need to improve her serve, about the lessons she was taking from the Czech problem, about the clay season ahead and the opportunity it represented. She did not deflect. She did not manufacture excuses. She did not point to the crowd or the atmosphere or her opponent's brilliance as reasons why the score should have been different. She lost in an hour to a better player on that day, and she said so with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who understands that development is a process, not a destination. She did say she thought she deserved a break, and she laughed when she said it. 2 days off after Indian Wells, now a few more before the clay season begins. For a 20-year-old playing her first full season at this level, running through 22 matches across 8 tournaments by the time March ended, that answer landed with a kind of exhausted honesty that was completely disarming. She was tired. She was disappointed. She was also already thinking about what came next. That combination, that refusal to stay in the moment of the loss any longer than necessary, is one of the things that makes her compelling beyond the results. What comes next is the clay season, and it matters more than any single result at Miami. Eala is scheduled to begin at the Upper Austria Ladies Linz Open, a WTA 500 event running from April 6th to 12th. From there, the European clay swing opens up in front of her in a way that is genuinely favorable for her ranking situation. This is the crucial point that gets lost in the immediate aftermath of a tough loss. After her 270-point drop from Miami, Eala enters the clay season with very little to defend. Her 2025 clay season results were modest. She did not go deep in Madrid or Rome or Roland Garros last year. That means every point she earns this spring is a net gain. Every round she advances is ranking points she did not have a year ago.